Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Vit and Elishka and everyone else who helped out with my arrangements and visit. And thank you all for coming. So this is a presentation on the visual politics of climate refugees, and I'm going to be speaking about images like this that should be pretty familiar to you from largely the mainstream media. So I want to talk about what role visual representation plays in relation to the formation of views about migrants or people who are displaced. And I'm also going to talk about some artistic practices toward the end. And since there's simultaneous translation, I'm going to stick more or less to my script. Migration, whether forced or voluntary, or somewhere in between, we know, is at the center of an intersection of forces. Their economic conditions, formal and informal, join with socio-technological ones, from new media to transportation systems, biopolitical factors such as governmental legal frameworks and border cultural arrangements meet military security restraints, increasingly directed toward the securitization of borders with artificial intelligence, weaponry, and surveillance. So I'm talking about the EU border, but also the border in the States, between the United States and Mexico, and many other borders that are proliferating globally these days. So migration is a site of intersectionality from which it should not be extracted. Despite mainstream media's tendency to focus on the faces and biographies of individuals and impacted communities, children, families, people at the origins, transit points, and destinations of dislocation, migration in fact reflects a multi-causal vector of determination, which also increasingly includes the environmental. During 2015, more than 1 million migrants reached Europe, mainly via Greece and Italy, as reports the UNHCR, that is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, charged with protecting the rights and well-being of refugees all over the world. 84% of those arriving in Europe came from the world's top 10 refugee-producing countries, including Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, strengthening UNHCR's belief that most of the people arriving in Europe were fleeing war and persecution. The massive displacement was said to constitute the greatest refugee crisis since the Second World War, according to Refugee Council Chief Executive Maurice Wren, the magnitude of which has, as we know, jeopardized the EU's commitment to open borders and borderless travel within its Schengen territory. It has threatened the EU's welfare policies, the fundamental cohesion, and even the very democratic principles of the EU. And indeed, we're going to hear in a little bit after my talk from Ruben and Maya about the post-democratic condition. The crisis, though exactly whose crisis remains to be seen, and indeed the term refugee crisis is problematic for a number of reasons. So the crisis also has led to a corporate media frenzy of sensationalist reporting, covering generally right-wing extremist politicians, such as Nigel Farage in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who have accused European countries like Germany with incentivizing migration, by providing care, housing, and benefits to refugees and asylum seekers, invariably letting in so-called terrorists and Islamic extremists. They've said that even as they have said this even as they have alternately blamed countries of being motivated by the prospect of slave labor in their calculations of incoming migrant quotas. So how many migrants can we accept depends on labor speculations. So with this framing of migration, we purportedly face what Wilders calls an Islamic invasion. And you see that with images like this. The projected image is a little dark here, but you get a sense of the masses of people coming toward the camera in this very threatening viewpoint. It's a typical example of xenophobia plus Islamophobia, leading to racist alarmism, once thought beyond the pale, but now legitimately frightening for the anti-democratic, even quasi-fascist support of such sentiments in the polls, with, for instance, Donald Trump's US presidential election campaign, lending further support for building walls and militarizing border security with full-spectrum dominance technologies, including automated weaponry with right-to-kill algorithms and futuristic-sounding biotech applications that target genomic patterns keyed to ethnic traits. Indeed, I noticed that there's a recent issue of the journal eFlux that just came out that's dedicated to considering the relation between the rightward movement of European politics and fascism. The result leads to camps and imprisonment, exclusion, desperation, inequality, and tragedy. According to this scenario, migration figures as a criminal menace, attended by $1 billion a year corporate state military industry, rather than an involuntary mode of behavioral adaptation for human survival in complex and insufferable emergency conditions, or an opportunity for cosmopolitan hospitality or humanitarian empathy, or liberal generosity for those in desperate need. And indeed, instead of recognizing the causes of migration in Western policies of austerity, unfair trade agreements, neoliberal structural adjustment programs, military intervention, and resource wars, migrants who are the effects of such complex systems are blamed for being responsible for the crisis. Yet this crisis and its dimensions, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about recently in the last year, measured in sheer demographic numbers, will likely be seen as insignificant in what lies ahead, as predicted by climate change scientists who identify a coming so-called climate departure, meaning the moment when we move beyond the historical range of averages of temperature toward catastrophic environmental transformation, set to occur globally in the mid-21st century, that is around 2050, so in a few decades, should no mitigation of greenhouse emissions take place in the meantime, and it doesn't look like there will be any change. As such, we can expect between 250 million to 1 billion people to be displaced globally by 2050. So in other words, that's 250 to 1,000 times the number of migrants who came to Europe in 2015 because of climate change. According to the predictions of the UN University Institute for Environment and Human Security and the International Organization for Migration, and also many other institutions and research bodies. So this includes mainly subsistence farmers, fishermen, coastal dwellers, and their families. The majority, their livelihoods devastated from climate change in the global south, will come north in the hopes of better lives, economic opportunity, security, and survival. In this regard, environmental factors compound economic ones, social and political ones, making matters worse, leading to more violence, more desperation, and providing further motivating conditions for migration. So climate refugees, as the term's used increasingly commonly, are at the center of what the political scientist Christian Parenti terms a catastrophic convergence. And by that term, he means a convergence of poverty, violence, and climate change, which makes it catastrophic. Where, for the writer Rebecca Solnit, climate change is violence, in the sense that environmental transformation is the result of criminally negligent behaviors in individual and corporate practice, legitimized through generally the most developed nations and their governments, whether it means polluting and logging tropical rainforests, allowing unsafe drinking water, or contributing to climate change through fossil fuel extractivism and consumption while funding climate denial. After decades of Western-led neoliberal structural adjustment, promoted by organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Council, debtor states worldwide have been stripped of resources. Their institutions of welfare, education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure tragically defunded, leaving few provisions that would help establish safe, secure, economically vibrant, and environmentally sustainable homelands for multitudes, particularly in the global south. According to the activist and writer Naomi Klein, the climate crisis is worsened by the fact that it comes at a time of neoliberal ascendancy, demanding further privatization, minimization of welfare, of healthcare and education funding, and maximizing free trade principles, compromising the ability of states to adapt to environmental transformation, which then exacerbates poverty and violence. We've seen nothing less than this case already in Syria. A scenario depicted clearly in this amazing nonfiction comic from 2014 that circulates still online by the New York-based artists and journalists Audrey Quinn and Jackie Roche. So I'm just showing you a couple images from this comic. It shows how a multi-year drought in Syria between 2006 and 2009 wreaked agricultural disaster in the country, driving urbanization and further impoverishment. So people were coming to cities where they couldn't find jobs. With urban areas deprived of their capacities of care for the internally displaced, which led in turn to uncontrollable violence, eventually igniting into civil war and despotic repression, international conflict, and mass exodus. So climate change, produced by a century and a half of industrial modernity, has functioned as a crucial threat multiplier, as it's called in the security and insurance industries, worsening conditions on the ground, even if it was never the single cause of conflicts like Syria's. And international climate governance for all the triumphalist celebration following the most recent UN climate change conference in Paris in 2015, called COP21, a celebration declared by the leading polluters in the wake of an accord that contains no binding agreements globally for any nation, offers little hope for the future. And indeed, one leading US climate scientist, James Hansen, who directed NASA for a number of years, called the COP21 Paris Agreement a hoax, coming at this time of urgent need. So it was a hoax because it offered no binding agreements to minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. As the Nigerian environmental activist Nima Bassi explains, the 2015 Paris Agreement will see to the sinking of small island nation states and the roasting of Africa. Some legal theorists argue that recognizing environmental refugees, for example under the Geneva Conventions, will grant them international assured protection, independent of the laws of their own governments. Yet, this suggestion raises complex questions, beginning with the fact that Article 1A of the 1951 Geneva Convention only grants refugee status, and you can read it online very easily, for those fleeing persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, social association, or political opinion. The term environmental refugee was only defined in a 1985 United Nations Environmental Program policy paper as designating those people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption, which means any physical, chemical, or biological changes to the ecosystem or resource base that render it temporarily or permanently unsuitable to support human life. So that's 1985. But that definition has yet to be recognized in any international law. So currently, environmental refugee or climate refugee is not a validating term granting any protections to those migrants, for example, from Syria. Recognition could occur, analysts point out, by expanding the Geneva Conventions and developing existing international law, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example, or extending the mandate of the UNHCR so that it protects climate refugees. There are nonetheless several reasons to question this route as a proposed response to climate change-induced displacement. First, it's difficult to define environmental causes and separate them from things like poverty, war, and any of the various factors coextensive with the effects of climate change. The climate refugee, by definition, represents an intangible figure, owing to the difficulty in disaggregating the causality of its circumstances. So the climate refugee, by definition, is wrapped up in a whole series of issues and motivating factors. So climate change exacerbates or worsens an already complex set of challenges for vulnerable populations, including uneven access to diverse resources such as water, land, infrastructure, institutions, capital, and the rule of law. Indeed, political theorists such as the German writer Angela Oels are critical of establishing such confusing and complex distinctions in classifying refugees, as it will leave plenty of room for thresholds of indistinction that leave the final decision on the status of life up to sovereign power, which can then abuse any ambiguity in oppressive ways. As well, placing climate refugees under the UNHCR's jurisdiction will not simply grant rights to refugees, it will also potentially transform them into objects or victims of humanitarianism, which can be withdrawn or withdraw their aid at any time. Consider, for example, the displaced people from Hurricane Katrina in 2015 in the United States, and their demeaning treatment in the sports stadium turned camp environment. That dystopian real-life scenario foreshadows the potential, at least one potential future treatment of climate migrants in the United States, the EU, and elsewhere, as those migrants deemed illegal are in fact already treated in a system of endless camps, bureaucratic hurdles, and degrading treatment. We can be skeptical then of proposals to institutionalize the climate refugee category. In addition, many would-be migrants reject the category entirely, and they reject the terms allotted to them by humanitarian groups and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who wish to enlist them as poster children in their politicized campaigns. In the eyes of small island state inhabitants threatened with rising seas today, for instance, the permission to cross a western border as a refugee falls short of the climate change remedies required. In other words, what they're looking for is extensive, immediate reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions and significant legal and financial action to redress lost livelihoods and gain self-determination if emission reductions are not achieved. In other words, we need to address the causes of climate change rather than simply focus on the effects. The problem is visual culture of mainstream media, as well as humanitarian imagery, tends largely to contribute to myopic portrayals of migrants, figures without ground, who are abstracted from these complex determinants, from the vector of intersectionality that is migration, which doesn't help matters. Here, the human interest story rules, the narrative that focuses on migrants themselves, mining consumable biographies and their commercialized troves of moving affects, abstracting them generally from the complexity of causality. Causality points to factors measured in scales of time and places that are supranational and deeply historical, factors much less visible or easily capturable by media, hard to visualize, that have made life impossible in many parts of the world. These connect invariably to histories of former conquests, imperialisms, and colonialisms over the last 500 years. In recent times, they've transmuted into new conquests and neo-imperialisms and neo-colonialisms, now carried out by, for example, the extraction industries, financial institutions, hedge funds, and vulture capitalists, enabled by so-called free trade agreements and supposedly friendly bailouts, economic arrangements enforced by military interventions, regime changes, and drone attacks, which make life unlivable in the so-called sacrifice zones of the contemporary capitalocene, the age of capital. So because the Anthropocene was mentioned as in the title for this discussion this evening, I suppose I should explain that I much prefer other terms, such as the Capitalocene. I find the Anthropocene to be regressive in the sense that it returns to the human as the agent of climate change. It generalizes the effects and causes of climate change so that it becomes a matter of species being rather than, for example, corporate activity on behalf of developed nations, and it is depoliticizing. So there's a variety of other options to choose from in terms of designating this current geological age. And I think Andreas Malm and Jason Moore have made a really provocative proposal with the term Capitalocene, and there's still others. So Capitalocene is the age of capital, and I think we're looking at the effects, or in a way the victims of that Capitalocene age in images like this. So for a quick survey of such climate refugee imagery, I've chosen 3 examples. First, very briefly, is the photography of the Argos Collective. This is a French group of photojournalists dedicated to documentary work, who have dedicated one of their series from 2010 to the category climate refugees, where we find images like this, an overhead shot of the low-lying Maldives islands located in the Indian Ocean, as you see here, so just below India and Sri Lanka. Obviously threatened by rising seas, and as such they're exemplary of a situation of small island nation states all over the world. Inhabitants are shown by the Argos group dealing with increasingly common flooding that is transforming such places into the front lines of climate change migration. Or consider the South Pacific island of Tuvalu, which appears, thanks to the Argos Collective, as if it's already underwater. Part of their series called A Polynesian Requiem. Activists point out that such catastrophic NGO narratives, which construct victimizing migrant identities and humanitarians as the heroic bearers of aid, that they represent, these images like this represent a form of wishful sinking. So there's a play in English, not wishful thinking, but wishful sinking. As if there's a desire to produce victims so that people can rush to their aid. So it's very self-serving and a kind of opportunism. Or consider the photography in a completely different context of John Stanmeyer, published in National Geographic. It's like a nature magazine in the States, which captures Syrian refugees in the most expected of ways. And this is, again, I'm showing this as a typical example of this kind of visuality. So the images dramatize their plight with all possible pathos. This is all John Stanmeyer. Or environmental allegory, or creative survival, mutual support, education and care, austerity, resignation, regeneration, and dread. It's as if we're looking through a telescope with historical and political blinders. In other words, we're looking past Syrian geopolitics, the region's experience of colonialism, decades of emergency rule, globalization, uneven economic liberalization, petrocapitalism, uprisings of political Islam, wars with Israel, relations to Iran, inter-ethnic and religious conflicts, and environmental crises. So all those complex factors are simply bypassed by this type of photojournalism. A third example is the so-called first climate refugees in the United States, as they were recently called by the New York Times. These are people from the Isle of Jean Charles in Louisiana. So this is what it looks like from overhead. And this is what I'm talking about. This area between Florida and Mexico, on the Gulf of Mexico. The range of images are on the whole much less victimizing than the Argos Collective's images or Stanmeyer's Syria. But still they focus in tunnel-like vision on the effects of climate change on people. So here we have an image of Violet Handon Parfait left with her son Reggie and mother Teresa Handon. And with her husband and 2 children, Miss Parfait lives in a trailer behind the wreckage of their house, destroyed by Hurricane Gustav in 2008, as the caption in the New York Times reads. Or this one, sorry again that they're so dark. The projector is doing that. Amia Brunet, of 3 years old, on the bridge that leads to her home, which fills up to a foot of mud during storms. Her parents, Keith Brunet and Keisha McGehee, would like to leave their island. So these people are Native Americans of the Beloshi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe, who have occupied the land for millennia, for thousands of years. But now they're forced, and not for the first time, to abandon it, if for different reasons than during US colonial expansion. As Chief Albert Nakin says, we're going to lose all our heritage, all our culture. It's going to be history. So with these types of stories, we can glimpse one potential future that will be massively expanded. Of course, many more people are under threat. Coastal zones and deltas across the world, from Bangladesh to Thailand, small island nation states suffering from sea level rise, such as Kivalina, the Marshall Islands, Manus and Nauru, the latter 2 in Micronesia, and used by Australia as offshore detention centers, where a vicious circle of climate change effects converge: rising seas, migration, and penal colonies. There are also areas prone to drought and desertification, like Sudan and Kenya, and regions like Alberta, Canada, Indonesia, and the Amazon, threatened with destructive forest fires, some of which I address in my recently published book, Decolonizing Nature. So you can, if you're interested, you can find much more elaborate analysis of these conditions in that context. So with these images, we confront an antinomy. On the one hand, corporate media, NGO, and humanitarian discourse conceptualize frontline communities as climate refugees or illegal migrants. And on the other, the members of these communities, many of whom steadfastly reject the refugee designation as victimizing, as depoliticizing, as a matter of displacing causes onto the human effects. So this is the political conflict that these images create. In fact, as we've seen, climate refugee discourse in general favors the spectacle of crisis, as well as the maladaptation over policies of climate change mitigation. It leads to a morbid curiosity regarding the seeming victims of far-off and inexplicable misfortunes, catastrophes, and so-called natural disasters, or worse, a racist xenophobia created by mass media and positioned against migration. What we don't typically see, except in exceptional cases, those of independent journalism and critical visual culture and certain models of contemporary art, is migrants as the human carnage of Western-driven policies, economic arrangements, military invasions, and environmental transformations, which might be challenged and changed. If climate change is, as the architectural research practitioner Eyal Weitzman says, if climate change is the telos of colonial modernity, which I would add only continues in our present, for the past is never dead, it's not even past, as William Faulkner claimed, then what would it mean to challenge its status? So what would it mean to challenge the idea that the telos of colonial modernity is climate change? My argument is that it's imperative for those of us who are coming from developed nations to reject such representations of migrants or refugees and criticize the proliferation in recent contemporary arts insofar as we find their empathic gestures of guilt-relieving identification. For example, with images like this by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, who posed as a drowned Syrian child, Alan Kurdi, in that very famous image. The 3-year-old Syrian refugee who tragically lost his life fleeing to a Greek island in 2016. Or we can point to the limitations of the naming of migrants by well-meaning activists that, in another recent case, forced politicians to walk over a 100-meter-long list of the names of the 17,306 refugees who have tragically died en route to Europe. And that's more than 10,000 have died since 2014. As happened in this installation in 2015 at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. For these images and lists keep us entranced, with eyes fixed upon a photography and discourse of effects, where the structural causes remain invisible. Rather than continually researching down, in other words, a methodology of study that tends to examine the disempowered as results of inequality, we might consider researching up and study the institutions of the powerful and their production of inequality. We might, for example, highlight the role of petrocapitalism, as does the Swiss video artist Ursula Biemann in this piece called Deep Weather from 2014. And she does this by showing the Alberta tar sands, which is the biggest such extractivist project on Earth. As you can see, producing massive amounts of emissions. And she compares that situation in Canada, in her short video, to the situation of Bangladesh's delta, where people are collectively preparing for the threat of rising seas. Or we could investigate the workings of neoliberal policies in relation to climate change governance. So, for example, this is the Corporate Europe Observatory, who investigated the kind of industries that were involved in sponsoring COP21, the UN climate change conference in Paris last year. And you can see all the major transportation, energy, and financial institutions that basically represent some of the leading institutions of petrocapitalism. So how can we expect any solution to the migration crisis, let alone to the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in, when the very people responsible for the production of catastrophic environmental breakdown are attempting to find a solution? And we can target Western militarism as a motor of catastrophic environmental transformation by many activists around the world who are doing this, right? All of which drive and produce migration in the first place. Instead of fixating on the plight of the unfortunate, who nonetheless do deserve greater empathy, institutions of hospitality and transition, and integration in our shifting global society, we need to redirect our energies, I would argue, toward climate change activism. One example is the global blockadia currently mounting to stop the causes of catastrophic environmental transformation, intervening in the very infrastructure of fossil fuel capitalism and its production of the conditions of unlivability. Not only in terms of supporting a visual politics of resistance, but through a militant research of solidarity, a collective activism in support of social movements that are the only thing that stands between us and a disastrous near future. So I'd show you one example, this project Ende Gelände, or Here No Further, and the activists associated with the Break Free project in May of 2016, as they're collectively going to occupy and shut down the Garzweiler lignite coal mine in the Rhineland in Germany. I think it's important not only to support 350.org's Breaking Free and projects like this against fossil fuels, as in so many direct actions and industrial shutdowns in May of 2016 and since then, as when some 1,500 activists shut down Europe's biggest source of CO2 emissions at this mine in Rhineland. But we also need to challenge the very rule of what's called military neoliberalism. The economic austerity plans, socio-political inequalities, and military infrastructure that creates the very conditions of environmental destruction by the consignment of nature to natural resources, and the commodification of everything from the soil to the atmosphere, where short-term profits are placed over long-term well-being. Similarly, we need to transform our approaches to migration from short-term crisis management to long-term objectives of economic and political inclusion and equality. Let's fight, then, for an altogether different world now, one of justice, equality, open borders, and sustainability. Thank you very much.